Thanks. It's really a pleasure and an honor to be here today. I appreciate all of you sticking around for the last speaker of the session today. I know I've learned a lot and I've enjoyed the things that have been said so far. When I was putting this together, I included cotton water, and then I thought, just in case I don't have enough material to go 30 minutes, I'll go ahead and add some slides at the end for fertility management. Then I got worried and thought, maybe I still won't have enough time, so I went ahead and added pictures of my children at the end. I have 7 of them, so I've got about 45 minutes of slides at the end, so just hang on. This is a slide from some of the work done with Cotton Incorporated. This is a slide that I got from Cater Hake talking about the quantity of yield that you can increase based on the quantity of irrigation that you have above dryland. You'll notice that there's a pretty wide range of increased yield over dryland, and Dr. Barnes touched on this a little bit during his presentation as well, this idea that the quantity of water that you put on can have either a large or a small impact based on the timing, based on the crop condition, and I'm hoping to talk about some of those features that are going to help us to maximize the quantity of yield that we get per inch of irrigation here. You've seen slides like this before based on work that Jim Berdovsky has done. Also, some of the work that Jeff Pate and Bob Glatt were showing and presenting as well. The idea that the quantity of water that we're going to use is based very much on the timing of the crop growth. Really early in the season, the bulk of the water loss is going to be due to soil evaporation. Later in the season, as you move into the vegetative and then the reproductive growth, that water use by the plants ramps up to the point where you have quite a bit of water used, somewhere between 0.25 and 0.3 of an inch a day. So you're looking at about 2 inches a week on average. The nice thing in West Texas about doing irrigation research is that it is easy to see changes in crop growth, cotton growth, depending on the environment that it's growing in. You're able to see the development of the fruit. The canopies are relatively easy to see into. You can easily pick out differences in plant height, ground cover fraction, and these relate largely to the overall yield. Before I came here to West Texas, my career was in South Georgia. You could get a really tall plant and it wasn't necessarily high yielding, whereas here very much the growth habit of the plant ties into the overall yield at the end. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about some of the physiology that we see related to the growth of the cotton plant. To start out with, before you get to about node 5 or 6, the bulk of the evaporation that you're going to have is from the soil. When you have this one-leaf plant that we see here on the right side, you're only going to be able to see one leaf that's expanded, but you have about 4 or 5 leaves that are hidden up in the apical meristematic tissue right here. This is actually a slide that I got from Craig Bednarz, who was here earlier, and that has all developed. By the time you see leaf 1, you already have leaf 4 and leaf 5 developing on the plant. So what does that mean for water? Well, it's not really a critical time to be putting water on. Generally speaking, if you have enough water to get your seedlings established and to get them to emerge out of the ground, you have enough water to carry you over through the first probably 4 or 5 nodes worth of plant growth here. And so the critical thing at this point is avoid wasting water to evaporation by not applying additional water. That also helps you by not cooling the soil, so you decrease the disease pressure that you have, and it gives you a chance to give the opportunity for the plant to grow a root system. If you have excess water, if you have a lot of water in the soil, the plant is going to adjust by putting extra energy into the production of the above ground portion of the plant as opposed to the root system. Believe it or not, when you get to first square, about 75% of the fruit is already on that plant in some form or fashion. It's very small, a lot of it's still in a state, but you've already made 75% of your fruit at this point. The plant still needs to do a lot in building some of the hidden structures. It's still producing nodes, it's still expanding the inner nodes, it's still doing a lot of the growth that is going to affect the overall growth habits of the crop later in the season. You're still not really at a point where yield is going to be largely sensitive to irrigation rate at this point. In fact, really, we start to see it probably above 3 to 3.5 bales is where we're really limiting ourselves at this point. So if you're looking at a 2 or 2.5 bale yield, this is not the point where you really want to be encouraging vegetative growth. You want to be minimizing the amount of irrigation at this point. As you get into first bloom, once you see the first flower on the plant, in West Texas, every fruit that's on that plant has already been developed at that point. And so you don't have to think in terms of, well, we need to grow this for another 3 or 4 weeks in order to produce additional fruit. They're already there. It's just a matter of being able to retain and maintain them. And this is really the critical portion of the crop growth cycle. You've seen that with corn, you've seen that with sorghum. Jeff and Scott talked in detail about that and did a very good job of describing the most sensitive periods of time to water stress. Cotton's the same way. It is also sensitive to water stress during the flowering and the fruiting cycle. The big difference is that with corn and with sorghum, you have one set of fruit that's going to be produced. If you're talking about sorghum, you notice that neat slide where it showed the relationship between the number of seeds and the yield and how you've got a very strong relationship between the two. Jeff had a slide where he was showing that with corn, you're looking at the number of kernels on the corn cob, the number of kernels around it, the number of kernels up it. With cotton, we're talking about a plant that fruits and flowers over a period of about 6 weeks. So instead of having a short period of time that is very sensitive to water stress, now we have a much longer period of time. But what we find is that we also have this relatively short period of time that is absolutely sensitive to water stress. As you go later into the season, as your bolls are produced on the plant, as you cut off the water, these bolls are not going to be shed. You may run into issues with immaturity. You may run into issues with less expansion of the individual bolls, but the bulk of your yield has already been set at this point. So this tends to be a period of time that is not particularly sensitive to water stress from a standpoint of yield. You do have some effects on the fiber quality and the maturity, though, at this point. So some of the stress signals that we look for in cotton, you've all seen these. The plant leaves start to turn a dark green, they start to wilt over, and then they eventually start to show chlorosis. You start to see fruit shed occurring here, and it really causes a problem. I was mentioning South Georgia. You can grow some really tall cotton if you need to. This is why you don't just try to play it safe and overwater. I received some good advice from Wayne Keeling a few years ago saying that to a large extent, if you're applying a lot of plant growth regulators to your cotton, it means that you've been overwatering. If you have this excessive vegetative growth in West Texas, it generally means that you're applying these water resources at periods of time that you don't really need them. And so one of the focus areas that we've worked on the last few years has been how do we actually measure the fruit load and the growth of the cotton plant. So we do a lot of what we call plant mapping, where we actually go out and look at the actual fruit production by node and fruiting position on the plant, which I'll show you a little bit more of. And one of the areas that we've been interested in is the timing of irrigation. So one of the trials that I'm going to show you some work from, we didn't irrigate it from first square to first flower. We didn't irrigate it from first flower to 3 weeks after. And then we didn't irrigate it late in the season to see what we would do. So here's what we found out. Here's our full irrigation over here. This is 2011. And you'll see that our yields range from about 1,300 to 1,500 pounds for our fully irrigated varieties here. If you cut off the water at squaring, you did see about a 25 to 30% yield drop. If you cut it off late, you saw about a 25 to 30% yield drop. If you cut it off at early flower, you could really do some damage to it. In fact, this is just a picture of a boll distribution. I'm required by law to show this because it took me like an hour to put this slide together. If you have an unstressed plant, your boll distribution is going to look something like this. Late in the season, as the plant runs out of resources, it's going to decrease the number of bolls that are retained on the plant. So this would be a typical unstressed plant. If you have a plant that you stress heavily at first flower, you have the sudden fruit shed and you see this dramatic drop off in the number of bolls. You'll see bolls per plant. That doesn't mean that each plant has, 4/10 of a boll. That means that 4 plants out of 10 are going to have a boll on them. And sometimes you can actually see some recovery based on a stress period here and then increased irrigation or rainfall here, and the plant starts to recover a little bit. So if you do set quantities of evapotranspiration rate, you see this nice decline of this fully irrigated, and then each of these steps down is about a 30% decrease in irrigation, and you see this nice relationship. If, on the other hand, you do it based on timing, you'll notice that if you cut off the water at squaring or late in the season, the boll distribution is actually fairly similar to what you get with fully irrigated. Now keep in mind our maximum yields here were about 3 bales, so as you get into 4 and 5 bale cotton, this changes a little bit. I would like to point out though, this is with that first square decrease in irrigation. One of my graduate students, who's a big Star Wars fan, looked at this and he said, "I felt a mighty disturbance in the force, like millions of voices crying out in terror." Apparently, that's what a cotton plant looks like when it's crying. What effect does it have on our fiber quality? Micronair is largely affected because it's related to maturity. Strength, generally we think of in terms of genetics, but if we get severe water stress, we see a dramatic decrease in strength as well in this. Length and uniformity, again, severe deficit, such as cutting the water off during first flower, is going to decrease that. I'm going to jump forward just a little bit here and show you kind of a summary of all of that. So if you cut off water during pre-square development, you maintain your fruit, your fiber quality stays good, in fact is as good, sometimes better than our fully irrigated, and our effect on fiber yield we saw ranged anywhere from about 20 to 35% depending on the year. That was during square development. During the first 30 days of boll development, which is essentially early flowering, you have severe problems with fruit retention. You really kill your fiber quality and you have a severe loss in yield. If you've got to partition your water to a specific time, this is the time to do it. As you get later into the season, you run into a little bit of issues with your fiber quality, but your yield loss decreases. And at the end of the season, it's actually good to cut back on the water some because it decreases the water in the soil. It increases the canopy temperature a little bit and it allows the crop to get done a little bit quicker. Some of the other work that we're doing is very similar to what's been talked about by Jeff and by some of the other speakers, which trying to do intercropping options where you mix and match sorghum and cotton, early planted, late planted, early irrigated, late irrigated, and see what happens here. And this is an example of the study. We looked at a lot of different combinations of these. And what we saw was that, first of all, we saw very similar patterns in the bull distribution based on whether we did it early or late, but we saw a lot of different patterns in the dollars per acre that you could make based on the mix and match version that you could do here. Now this is a little misleading. It makes it look like, all we have to do is plant, sorghum and cotton on a full-size center pivot and then irrigate both of them completely, and that's the best thing to do. Well, the purpose of this was to do deficit situations, and so these are the deficit situation options that we have here. You can see that we have specific matches of deficit irrigation that allow us to maximize the profitability of both cotton and sorghum within an intercropping system. So perhaps you could put, half your pivot, a quarter of your pivot to one crop, 3/4 to the other, and be able to mix and match to try to get the top yield or return on investment that you have. So less critical early season, late season, more critical right as you're getting into flowering. All right, I think we're just about out of time, so I'm going to jump ahead just a little bit, only to, what's that? Oh gosh, I've got plenty of time. Good thing I loaded all those pictures of my kids at the end, huh? Let me talk really quickly about some of the big three nutrients as they relate to cotton production and cotton irrigation. Nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium are all important at large rates in the crop because they're all part of major plant processes here. Nitrogen is it's something that is easy for the plant to get through the water stream. If your plant is transpiring, you're getting nitrogen into the plant, assuming it's there. The problem is, if you get rain or if you over-irrigate, nitrogen also is very easily within the soil, and it's easy to leach it out of the soil. It's also, if you have too much water, going to be converted into gas, and it's going to escape out of the plant system as well. These are simply, I teach a crop physiology class and we play around with numbers a lot. If you are assuming a 50% harvest index, seed plus lint, and about 60% seeds by mass, and that's a little bit optimistic for cotton. But just using those kinds of numbers and the quantity of nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium that you have in the plant tissues, that would come out to, if you're looking at 4-bale cotton, you would need, just based off of these numbers, 150 pounds of nitrogen, 20 pounds of phosphorus, which that seems pretty low, but keep in mind that phosphorus uptake is a real trick with plants. It's not something that, if you've got 20 pounds of phosphorus in the soil, the plant's not going to take up 20 pounds of phosphorus. Potassium is more like about 100 pounds per acre here. And not only that, but the form that they're in is very critical as well. Plants take up ammonium easier and it's less expensive for them than nitrate. The problem is that it's also toxic to the plant. And so if the plant could only take up ammonium, it would run into some real problems there. You don't have any large amounts of ammonium that are translocated from the roots to the shoots and the xylem, and so it's really critical that you apply the nitrogen in a way that the plant's going to be able to take up the nitrogen it needs when it needs, but you don't put so much into the soil that it's going to get away from you. It's easy to waste nitrogen just like it's easy to waste water. With that, I think I'm just about out of time, but I'd like to see if we have any questions.